Jeff Erichsen, welcome to Over the Bonnet.
Thanks for having me, Mark.
We've been great mates for a long time, and you're now moving into something that I don't know a lot about, and I'd like to talk to you about it today, and that's neuro-physics. Tell us all about it.
It's a rehabilitation of the nervous system. It was developed by a man called Ken Ware, formerly of Mackay, and it's based around some very, very heavy scientific principles, but the beauty of what he's done is he's broken it down to some very simple principles by which our system behaves. And they're based around 6 pillars that are responsible for how our system behaves and responds to its environment.
Can you explain more?
Yeah, sure. If we start off with, I guess, the first 3 pillars, which are posture, emotions, and environment, and in particular the first one, which is posture. Yeah, and whenever I speak about posture, you see everybody adjusting themselves, because intuitively we know, right, that we should have good posture. And that's really funny that you did that, because it's what everyone does when we start talking about posture. And that comes from intuition, that we know that if you have good posture and you're sitting or standing upright, then you're healthy, okay? And if we saw someone walking down the street who was exhibiting good posture, chin up, chest out, and strolling along quite relaxed, we'd say, well, that guy looks like he's happy and healthy. And conversely, if we saw someone walking down the street with their chest depressed and shoulders rolled forward, we'd intuitively look at them and say he doesn't look too happy. But what I like about what Ken's done in the realm of posture, and there's a lot of research to back this up, by the way, so it's not just him on his own, is that he's related that to information processing. And if you take that as a step further, when you're in a nice postural state, then you can imagine that we're actually processing a lot about our environment, okay? And if we take that through an evolutionary phase, back in the day when we were wandering around the jungle, if you and I were wandering through the jungle and we were talking, and then I thought I saw something up ahead that was possibly dangerous, like a snake or a tiger or something, then intuitively I would elevate my posture and try and look ahead and see if that was in fact something that was going to be dangerous to me. So I wouldn't sort of be crouching down like this. And so we know that if we want to process more information about our environment, then we elevate our posture. And what that means to the health of the system is able to process information about its environment, whereas people who are exhibiting poor posture are pretty much only processing enough information to survive or to carry out their task or whatever it is they're doing in their day-to-day life. So that's one of the most fundamental things about neurophysics I've enjoyed.
So how does it work, though, when you're actually doing the actual treatment? What goes on?
Okay, so if we combine the first pillar with the next 2 important or most important pillars, which are environment and emotions, when we are taking someone into therapy, and this is the other amazing thing that Ken's done, he's taken ordinary weights machines and turn them into very specific therapeutic devices. And the reason why he's been able to do this is because he's understood that those weights machines are just a piece of metal, but they are a way of introducing sensory input. And the second thing he's done in relation to information processing is he's understood that moving that very, very light weight very, very slowly allows the person to feel and allows the trained therapist to see what sort of responses that information processing is producing from within that person's system. So if we think about the weight, whatever it may be, and usually it's very, very light, it is non-threatening, and if it's done very slowly, it's certainly not dangerous. So if we are receiving a response from that sensory input, or if we're seeing a response in the patient, then that tells us how that system and that person responds to their everyday environment.
What's the correlation here? You talk about a response.
When you are moving the weight slowly, so anybody, if I was to jump on say a leg press, and it wouldn't matter whether the leg press is here or in London or in Brazil, a leg press is a leg press. So the system knows what a leg press is once it's introduced to the leg press, if you don't know what it is once before. And then as you move the weight down very, very slowly, you'll often see some kind of muscular reaction, so shaking, in its most mild cases, can evolve into a large tremor in other cases. But the point is it is a response. And based on how much weight or sensory input there is, that response is often an unnecessary response or an overreaction to that amount of weight. And yet it's experienced in everybody that comes along and engages in that type of movement. So Ken and his team have developed this method of being able to visually see those responses, correlate them to what the patient is feeling, and then teaching them using goals and cues to deal with that response in a really calm, comfortable manner, which they wouldn't have done before. We all store stress from the amount of information that we process about our environment. In our day-to-day world, it's bigger and faster than it's ever been. And unfortunately, our nervous system has not evolved fast enough to deal with the amount of information that we're processing. So a simplified version is that when we experience an overload of information, we often tighten up in areas that are related to our fight-flight response. So our trapezius up here, our chest, our abdomen, we hold our breath, and even our adductors. So by teaching the system to relax in those areas, no matter what the input is, you're teaching your system to deal with stress coming in from its environment. And then what you get out of that is an ability to stay calm most of the time under various inputs of stress from the real world. So that's the real game changer for the everyday person.
Tell us about Ken Ware that's developed this system.
Yeah, so Ken Ware, as I mentioned before, is from Mackay, where I grew up, and I'd come across Ken quite a few times. And he was an ex-Mr. Universe in the 80s. And he went on to become an Australian powerlifting champion right into his 40s. So he pretty much practices what he preaches. But what I believe Ken's story is, and I hope I've got it 100% right here, is that in the 1980s, when he was training for Mr. Universe in Western Australia, he was struggling a bit and lifting a lot of heavy weights and was in a fair bit of pain because of that. And then he noticed some older English guys training, and they were lifting some incredibly heavy weights, but doing it very slowly and in a very composed manner. So when he went over to speak to them, they said to him, look, your technique's terrible and you're trying to lift too much, and if you keep that up, you're not going to have much of a long career and you're going to suffer for it for a long time. So the best advice we can give you is to go home, take all the weight off, practice your technique, start again, and then build up from there. And when he did that, he experienced what is now known as the Ware-K tremor. And that was the nervous system responding to the amount of stress that he'd stored within there, because obviously the weight was very, very slow, very, very light, and he was performing the exercise very, very slowly. So the weight had nothing to do with it, and the speed and what was stored in his system and its response had everything to do with it. So he spent the next 30 years or so developing that into a system that was repeatable and was able to be reproduced for every person. And an amazing amount of science and research has gone behind that 30 years before anyone would actually even talk to him about it. And now he's got quite a well-known presence in the area of rehabilitation from spinal cord injuries and brain injuries.
So you've got an athletic background yourself. How did you incorporate the neurophysics and get introduced to it in the first place?
Yeah, so it was actually from rehabilitation. There were two things going on in my life at the time, and they were fairly significant. The first one was that I'd torn the bicep off my bone in an accident when I was helping finish off my house. And the second thing was I was going through a bit of a tough time mentally through a breakdown of my business. And when I was doing some rehabilitation in the gym, I was introduced to this therapy from one of the personal trainers at the gym who knew that I was open-minded. I've tried a whole heap of different things in my life. And so I rang Ken and asked him if he would mind if I came out and did a bit of training with him and had a look at what he was doing, and he was more than willing. He remembered who I was from our interactions years ago, and out I went, and what I observed was quite mind-blowing.
What was so groundbreaking that made you look?
Yeah. Well, more than what I observed, I guess more importantly was what I felt during the process, and it's something that anybody who's been through his process struggles to really explain, because it is such an experiential technique. But the long and the short of it for me was, I went out there, very tired, very stressed, very upset, and spent a few days with him, and then honestly felt like I'd left there feeling 10 years younger. And then I realised that basically, like anything in life, if you want to improve, you've still got to do the work. Regardless of how good whatever it is you've been introduced to, you've got to do the work to make it stick. So I did the work, and I'm making it stick. You've
had a great work ethic over your time, because when we first met, it was in the amateur boxing ranks. Tell us about your boxing career.
Yeah, well, that career started in the late 1980s, 1987 in fact, when I was 13 years old. And it progressed on and off over the years until I was about 32 or something. So my last fight was in 2004, and it was all amateur, but I accumulated 70 odd fights over that period, which, I guess in the scheme of things in the world is not a lot of fights, but for an Australian boxer it's a reasonable number of fights. But I enjoyed my time as a boxer tremendously. I learnt a hell of a lot about myself in that time, and that's pretty much what has set me up for most of the good things and some of the bad things in the rest of my life.
Talk about the success. I know it's something that you don't like to sort of dwell too much on these days, but it's a pretty important part of your makeup.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And I guess I don't talk about it a lot because I don't feel like it has to define me.
Did it?
No, but it made me who I was.
But when you were younger, did you find that it defined who you were, or at least other people tried to put a label on you because of who you were?
Absolutely. I mean, I let it define me because it was me for a long time. But I think, like all things, and yes, I did get labels put on me, and I guess that's all part of the journey, right? And then at some stage in your life, you've got to realise that if you want to keep on living, then you must move past whatever it was that you thought you were before. And, going back to that journey, I guess for, 8 or 9 years, boxing was everything in my life, So I started off as a junior, as you said, and I'd had a few fights, and then I won half of those out of 4, 2 out of 4, and I thought, this isn't very good, even as a 14-year-old. I didn't like that, So I thought, I'm going to go back to the gym and train a little bit harder and fix a few things up and get a little bit stronger. And then I came back when I was about 16, and that year I managed to progress through the Queensland and into the Australian titles, which I won. So that was a great start. And then the next year following, I won the Australian senior title, and the year after that. And then in the following year, I actually got stopped in my Australian titles finals fight. And so that was a big wake-up call, because that had never happened before. And I know I suffered a hand injury earlier the next year, and that put me out for another 6 months. And then I went back and I lost to the same guy, but fortunately I stayed on my feet this time and was able to complete the fight. So that was good. It's funny because I remember that night, and this guy could hit really hard, and he was really sharp. And So the first round he caught me a couple of times, and I stayed on my feet, and I started to come back, but didn't do enough, I guess, to win the whole fight. But I was actually very happy that I was able to do that, you know. And then the following year, I think I won, and then I had a few years off in boxing and went around working around Australia in the mining industry, where I didn't really train a lot and probably drank a little bit too much and had a little bit of fun, which was great. Thoroughly enjoyed it. And then when the Olympic Games was announced to be in Australia, I thought, well, if I'm going to have a try at that, now's the time. And I ended up moving to Perth in early 1998. So I think I moved to Perth in about February, March, and the Australian titles were in November. So I didn't have a lot of time, and I wasn't in, definitely not in fighting shape. So it was a pretty tough year. I pretty much funded myself and trained 3 times a day, most of the days during the week. And I was also really intent on changing my style and becoming a better boxer, which I focused more on. So it was a lot of changes for me, but it ended up with a success at the end of the year and winning the Australian title, which was really good.
How do you feel, though, when you're defined as the Australian champion? Do you think it's something that was it something that you worked hard to get away from?
Yes. As you get older, I mean, it was great when you were, when I was young and boxing, and, we've all got a bit of a bigger ego than we probably should have. But it was really interesting at that period in time. What I was really interested was in becoming a really nice, proficient, technical boxer. So I'd already, over the few years break, done a bit of work to leave that part of it behind, as far as I wasn't sort of too worried about what anyone thought of how tough I was, or, how rough a fighter I was, which is what the first 50-something fights of my career was about. It was just about out-toughing and out-puffing everybody, being fitter than everyone or tougher than everyone, and winning that way. And so I'd already made part of that transition coming into the 1998 fights, and I was more about becoming a really, really proficient boxer, which is what I wanted to be. And I felt that I achieved that. But in doing that, I also felt that I probably wasn't as fit and as tough as I needed to be to make it to that international level. And subsequently, I didn't. But am I happy about the whole journey? Absolutely, yeah.
So what did you change when you went to become a more efficient boxer and a better boxer? What did you do that was different from, say, the first 50 fights?
Well, first of all, I had a different trainer, and he was very technically focused, which is what I actually really enjoyed from the first time I watched him train people. So it suited the direction that I wanted to go in. And then what I did, so my average day of training in Perth was wake up at 5 in the morning, and the gym was only, a couple of kilometres up the road. So regardless of whether it was 0 degrees or 40 degrees, I was in the gym at 6 a.m. and I would do 15 rounds of technique only. So that was something I never did before. And then I would have a lunchtime run or a swim or something. So I'd do 5Ks or run Jacob's Ladder or swim a couple of Ks in the pool. And that was my lunchtime workout. And then I would do my standard boxing workout in the evening, which, could involve pad work, bag work, and sparring and what have you. So I guess the real difference was the 15 rounds of technique every day that I did. That made the difference.
So when you were doing that and you were just doing technique, you say you weren't as fit, but you came from a real fitness-oriented training regime where you were trained by your dad. And do you think you should have kept that regime up in a way?
Yeah, to a certain extent. So if I look back now and knowing what I know now about the nervous system and overtraining, I spent most of my time in those first years overtrained. And I don't know if you remember, but if a cold went by me, I caught it. So my immune system was down, and I know you struggled with a lot of that at times as well through your training periods, because we were always just training so hard, you know. Whereas in Perth, I probably didn't train as hard. I remember getting a bit crook there in the winter, and having to back off a bit. But overall, I was probably a little bit underdone. So it would have been great to have the balance of both. So if I could have asked for anything, I would have had both of those trainers training me at the same time. And I think that would have been almost the balance.
Because your dad didn't want you to train and he didn't want you to box.
Not initially, no. No, he, I mean, it's a tough sport, and, you know.
It's an honest sport, though.
Oh, incredibly honest, yeah. And, you know, my first boxing lesson was a bit of a touch-up from my father, but not in reality, looking back. But it was certainly a wake-up call when he brought home the gloves after me nagging him for months and months after I'd turned 13. And then we did a little sparring session, and every time I walked into one. And, you know, that resulted in a few tears and him pulling me aside saying, "Listen, mate, this is a tough sport, you know. I'll train you, but it isn't fun. It isn't what you think it is. It isn't what a movie is. You got to work hard, and you're going to have people who you don't even know punching you in the face on a daily basis as part of this journey. So, do you really want to do it?" And I said, "Yeah, absolutely, but I just want to do it better."
And your brother followed in your footsteps as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So Stephen was a very capable athlete, too capable for my liking. He was good at everything, and he was the same with boxing. We actually, you know, weren't sure whether Stephen would like boxing, but he was just absolutely as natural at boxing as he was with soccer and tennis and football and basketball and whatever else he chose to do. And I've always said he was far more talented than I was. He just didn't train at it for as long as I did.
How successful did you get in the pursuit of the Sydney Olympics?
So I ended up in the Australian team as I won the Australian title, and then I went away to the Institute of Sport to prepare for the Oceania Games, which were held in Tahiti, and that was the final leg to get to the Olympic Games. And unfortunately, I lost in my first fight to the guy who eventually won it, a Samoan. And so I ended up with a bronze medal, and I didn't end up going any further in my pursuit of the Olympic Games. But am I happy with it? Absolutely, yep.
Do you have any regrets?
No, I don't actually. I look back and I think I learnt an incredible amount. I learnt 2 different ways of doing the one thing, which most people don't in their life, particularly when it comes to fighting sports, and you know as well as I do, a lot of people, they learn one way, and that's the only way, and they do that for their whole life. And I'm not taking that away from anybody, but I was really happy that I was actually able to completely change my technique and become a really nice boxer, or I felt that I was a nice boxer. So it really matters to me little what anyone else thinks. I'm really happy with what I achieved and how I went.
Thoughts of going pro? Were they after you made the Oceania titles?
No, actually, the thoughts of going pro was when I was a younger guy, when I was 17, 18, when I was going to do my trade. That was the toss-up between, you know, maybe moving away and turning professional, or staying home and doing a trade. So, no, I was definitely at the time of the Oceania Games. I was definitely. I'd felt that was it. Okay, I tried, and I'm happy with my effort. I could have done things a bit better, but I'm really happy overall. So it's time to get on with life, and I had a passion for travel, which I pursued for quite a number of years after that.
You had the choice to become a professional boxer or get a trade. What happened then?
Yeah, so Dad was always big on getting a trade, and I'm forever grateful for that, because he said to me, "Okay, well, you can go and become or try professional boxing if you want now, and you might try that for a few years, and if it doesn't work out, then what are you going to do? You need a trade to fall back on." And he remember that he was very anti turning professional, and so we agreed that I would do my trade first, and then I would still be young enough to turn professional if I wanted to. So I did my trade, and in the time of those years, the year that I injured my hand, I actually went down to Sydney and trained with Johnny Lewis, and that was at the time he was training Costa Zoo, and he had a lot of good fighters in his stable there. So I was able to go down as a young country amateur boxer and train with and observe some of the country's and the world's best professional boxers.
What was the thing that stood out to you when you were down there?
One of the things my father said to me before I left, which is one of his, little geniuses of wisdom that he left me with, was he said, listen, son, you're going to go down and train with all of these big name people that you see on TV and that you admire so much. And it's going to be easy to get swept up in all of that. But remember that at the moment, you're an amateur boxer and you can enjoy any time off that you want. You are earning money from a good job, and so you have a lot of luxuries as far as that goes. These guys that you're going to watch, that's their job. That's what they do every day. And if they don't do it, then they won't succeed, and they probably won't feed their family. So and they probably work another job as well. So they don't just do it as a profession, but they've got to work a job until they get to the heights that they need to be. So I really did go down there with that lens, looking through that lens. And, while it was all very exciting, I did stand back and think, yeah, you know what? I don't think this is for me.
You look at someone as good as Costa Zoo. Was he as good as they say he was when you got to see him in person?
Oh, absolutely. I tell this story a lot. I went down there and I considered myself to be super fit. I was, running 10 kilometres well under 40 minutes. I could remember doing 1,000 sit-ups straight and someone timing me, and I did it in 34 minutes. And, I was swimming and running and sparring 10 to 12 rounds, a lot of training sessions, so I thought I was fit. And then one day, Johnny Lewis said, why don't you go up with Costa and do a leg workout today? And that lasted for an hour, and I couldn't walk properly for 3 days later. And I was actually blown away that not blown away that he was that fit, but I was blown away that I couldn't keep up, and I thought I was fit. I was cramping, and it was next level, obviously. So obviously training-wise, when you're an amateur boxer, you're an amateur, and you don't realise the gap between professional boxers and amateur boxers, just like most people on the street don't realise the gap between an average person on the street who's not trained and an amateur boxer. So I well and truly realised that gap. And there was I can't remember his name, but there was a New Zealand professional training there, and I sparred with him, and basically I felt like I was standing still.
I remember the first time I was hit by an Australian professional middleweight, a fella called Steve Peel.
Yep.
And I got hit by Steve with a body shot, and I thought, sledgehammer. And everyone was a sledgehammer.
Absolutely.
Tim Zoo is now stepping up into the spotlight and trying to step out of his father's shadow. How good do you think he can go?
Oh, I think he's amazing. I mean, I watched that fight the other night, and he's just so composed. He's got obviously a lot of his father's composure in him, but I think everyone has been very hard on him because of his father's legacy, and they're not really seeing who he is and who he could be. Australia is producing an amazing group of young boxers at the moment, and he's certainly at the top of it. And I think he's got an amazing future ahead of him. And I look forward to seeing him. And I certainly don't feel like I have the ability to critique him.
Well, you've got a little bit of ability. Now, when you're talking about you went two types of training, you went hard and you went soft. What brought about the soft, and where did that all come from?
In the gap years that I had there, I sort of realised, and there was actually one telling fight, and I'm not sure if you were there, but when I fought the New Zealand champion, Greg Bell, he came to Mackay and we fought. And Greg was an excellent boxer, and he was quite a bit taller than me. And that night, I certainly received some type of schooling. And I fought very hard, and once again, I'm very proud of how I fought. I didn't give up. and I fought very, very hard, and we're actually friends to this day. And through my business, I travel to New Zealand pre-COVID and catch up with him regularly, and we always laugh because it was a hard fight for both of us. But what I took away from those last few years there was that I certainly needed to change if I was going to become any better. And when you get that time off, when you're in it, you don't really get the time to sit back and review. But that few years I took off, and I spent time training lightly, and I guess I just realised what I wanted to be, and that was to be a really good technical boxer. And then I felt that I needed to be that if I was going to become any better. So that was the driver.
So looking at the relaxation side of things as opposed to the hardness.
Yeah, looking at how to perform and stay relaxed. And it's something that I didn't crack really in my career. The last time I fought an Australian title was in 2003, and I wasn't actually training for it. I went there as a trainer. And long story short, I was right into meditation then. So before the fight, because I knew I wasn't fit, and I knew that I had to stay relaxed, otherwise I would blow out too quick, I actually meditated before the fight. And believe it or not, it's one of the best performances I've had, in the ability to mix the soft and the hard, stay the right amount of relaxed, and still perform well. So that last period when I was training was certainly where I started to gel it all together, and I started to realise what I was missing. But it was too late.
So where did you learn from? The samurai, you've told me at different times, so that what did you learn from that ancient martial art?
Yeah, we spoke about that a little bit, and I did a lot of research between 2000 and 2002, 3 and 4, where I was just trying to understand from martial arts, from people who fought to the death, like the samurai, how they prepared, what they did, best. And what I read a lot about was that they meditated a lot, and their aim was to stay calm during the fight, not to pump themselves up, which is exactly the opposite to what I did. So before I used to get into a fight, I used to hype myself up so that I could deal with my nerves and overcome my fears and jump in that ring and fight hard. And so when I did all this research, and this later on translated so well through Ken Ware, was that we need to be able to stay calm under that pressure. And I looked at those beautiful boxers in history like Muhammad Ali, Prince Nassim and Hamed, Kostya Tszyu, and the Russian who I still can't remember. Terrible. Anyway.
Vasily
Lomachenko.
Yeah,
my goodness.
That's him.
That's taken me a long time to remember. Beautiful, right? And so relaxed and calm and focused, And so they're living proof that that you don't have to pump yourself up to go into that ring. You can stay deadly calm and still perform beautifully.
And obviously a better way to equip yourself when you are under pressure.
Absolutely, in everything, right? The calmer you can stay, it's what I tell to my kids. The worst thing you can do in any situation is panic. And the calmer you can stay, the better you can deal with it. The more composed you are, and the more you will see the situation for what it is, rather than overly emotionally reacting to it.
Tell us about the meditation.
Yeah, in about 2002, when I was living in London, I'd read a fair bit about meditation already, and I'd read a heap of books about spirituality and what have you. So I was kind of looking to that inner path rather than the outer path, which is what I was experiencing through the boxing. And I joined a meditation group in London, and then I kept that up for a long time. And then it wasn't until 2008 that I attended my first proper retreat, and that was under a bit of duress, because that was during or just after the global financial crisis, which I'd just started my business 1 year previously. So I had decided to go down and attend a retreat for 10 days, doing Vipassana meditation just north of Brisbane here. And one of the most difficult things I've ever done in my life, but also one of the most rewarding things I've ever done in my life. And then I kept that practice up for quite some time, and then it fell away a little. And then when the mining business started to fail in 2012 due to the downturn, I sent myself packing off there again. And once again, absolutely loved it and got a lot out of it. And it's certainly...
What's so difficult about the Vipassana? What do you find the hardest thing?
Well, you're meditating 12 hours a day for 10 days straight. So if you've ever tried to sit in a room and deal with yourself only for 12 hours a day for 10 days, it's quite a difficult task. So you can't hide from yourself in that. Part of Vipassana is you're not allowed to look at anyone, you're not allowed to talk to anyone, and you're not allowed to gesture to anyone. So you're to completely isolate yourself from anybody else who's attending the meditation and sit with yourself for 12 hours a day and deal with whatever comes up. And in that amount of time, 120 odd hours, a lot comes up.
It's interesting though, here's the boxer, the Australian champion, yet the meditation subject at the same time. Is it a clash of cultures?
No, I actually got to understood that boxing was a vehicle that I used, I guess, to express, you're a young man, you want to be someone and you want to be something, and you want to be like your father. There's a lot of things there culturally that I used boxing to express that through. And one of the funniest things that I realised was that I probably spent 20 years turning myself into something that I wasn't really at my core. And then I've spent the next 20 years undoing that. And like I've always said, there's absolutely zero regret for boxing there because it taught me a lot. But what I realised at a point of time after that 1998 period was, who am I? Who do I want to be for the rest of my life besides a boxer? Because I'm not that anymore. And I really just wanted to learn to do things better and be calmer and be happier and not to need to persistently drive myself to do something to feel like I was worth something. And so, but I also loved that strict requirement for discipline, which is why I love business. It's not actually about the money. It's about being able to strictly stick to your game plan for a long period of time, regardless of the adversity that comes against you.
Building up the business, you started out, you got your apprenticeship, didn't turn professional. Talk us through that process.
Yeah, so I decided to obviously finish my trade and then go travelling and continue on my education. So part of that travel was the good thing about my trade is that diesel fitters in mining are required all over the world. So it was an easy step for me to go to the other side of the country and pick up a job and do some travelling, which is what I wanted to do. And I love Australia. I love everything Australia had to offer. So I was one of those people who wanted to travel Australia first before I did overseas travel. And so I spent, quite a few years doing that. I lived in Western Australia for almost 5 years, I think, or maybe 6, before I went overseas. And, I just absolutely loved it. I love the bush. I love being in the desert. I love travelling around in those remote places because that feeling of remoteness is just what I love.
What did that teach you?
That was interesting because I didn't realise at times how isolated I felt. So you're in the middle of the desert, in the middle of nowhere, and you're surrounded by people that you don't know really that well. So over the long term, you realise that you have to learn how to deal with that isolation on its own. And then I put myself on some of those breaks even further isolated. So it was one of those, I guess, mental challenges that I set myself. How isolated could I get and still deal with it well, And so that was a learning curve on its own, just to learn how to deal with isolating yourself even further and further, like pushing those boundaries.
Is it a form of meditation?
To a certain extent, if you love nature like I love it and love being out there in the bush, and I can remember doing a motorbike trip by myself, 5,500 kilometres through the Western Australian desert, and waking up days there by myself in the middle of the desert, looking at the Hamersley Ranges or Monkey Mire or Coral Bay, these little beautiful out pockets when back in the 90s, which were very, very quiet, and just being an absolute bliss, like meditation.
So it was a form of meditation. You went inside.
Absolutely.
You went outside, but you went inside.
Absolutely, yeah. It was that connection to nature.
So you started to build your business. How did that all come about?
Yeah, I went to England for a couple of years, and then I came home, and then I worked as a contractor, as I always have, in mining. And I've never, it had been a long time since I really enjoyed my trade. So I was looking for something else, and at that time, that something else appeared to be going into business for myself, as my father had been for my whole life, and having that challenge. So the challenge for me was, can I build a business? Can I sustain my family or my future family on it at that time? So that was like another natural progression into one of those challenges, you know. And yeah, be careful what you ask for, I say.
So where did we get to?
Well, by 2012, I had nearly 30 people working for me, and I had a workshop in Mackay. I'd made it through a GFC, so that was a really interesting time, and the meditation and all that played a big part in that. So that's where I brought that business to before that next slowdown period.
So what happened then?
Mining slowed down significantly, and I went from about 28 guys, I think it was, down to about 4 guys in a very short period of time. And what I was left with was a lot of infrastructure and a lot of equipment debt that I had to pay for. So it was a very difficult time for me, and over the next 12 months to 2 years, we pretty much almost went bankrupt, and to the point where I told my wife that we were probably going to have to lose the house. You know, so that's for a man and a father, that's a difficult thing to have to do. Yeah.
What was her reaction?
Oh, you know, she was very upset, and but you know, she stuck by me. We stuck together. We've been through a lot of ups and downs, and as every relationship does, but we've always stayed together, and we've always supported each other through those times. And when you've got a supportive wife and a couple of young kids, you sort of have to reframe how you think about your life and think about what's important. And so my driver and what kept me afloat at that time was, okay, I've got a roof over our heads, the kids are fed.
Well, at the time.
But even if I have to rent, right? So the thought process for me was, okay, well, you know, we're going to survive. We're going to get through this. And in world standards, we're not in poverty. You know, 90% of the population out there in the world lives in poverty. If we're in the Western world in Australia, we're not living in poverty. So it's not as bad as I'm making it out to be in my head, even though it feels like it at the moment. And that was how I got through that.
So where did you go to from there as things are looking pretty bleak?
Yeah, it allowed me to take my blinkers off, and then I ended up using infrared technology quite by accident, actually.
How did you get into that?
So I was building a house at the time in 2012, and things had just started to slow down dramatically at the end of that year. And there were some problems with the structure of the house, and I wanted to know how I was going to figure that out. And it was a core-filled block house. I was a bricklayer's son, so I grew up on building sites. So I knew exactly what it should have been, but it didn't appear that it was. The only problem is you can't see into walls, right? But I remembered the infrared camera salesman who lived locally telling me about its ability to determine different levels of insulation in a building through the thermal pattern that you could observe from the outside. So he'd been talking to me a lot about bringing that into my business in the earth moving, but I had my blinkers on, so I sort of always dismissed it. And so what I did was I rang him and said, do you think you could help me out here, just see which blocks are core-filled and which aren't? And he said, yeah. And he came around, and with limited knowledge, to me it looked like X-ray. And that's when the penny dropped. And I realised, wow, this technology can see everything that I can't see. And I really need, what have I got to lose, right? I'm going broke. So this could be a fantastic new avenue. So
how did you want to apply it? What was your thinking at this stage?
My main, time as a diesel fitter was spent as working on bulldozers and diggers and trucks. Okay, so a lot of the things that fail on those components get hot first. So it sort of made sense to me that the earlier you could identify those failings in a temperature modality, the earlier you could do something about it and fix them. So if this technology was as good as I thought it was, and this camera was $40,000 on its own, then I bought a lens worth $15,000, and then I bought a laptop and a course, so $60,000 was the gamble. But if it could do what I thought it would do, then that would be doing something that nobody was doing that I knew of, in that time. The difficulty was when I did my research is that I realised that there were there was no standards for that equipment. And, I paid for webinars and did all sorts of things, and the information I was getting was quite rudimentary. So I realised that there was really no depth in what a lot of people were doing. A lot of people were saying they were doing these things, but there was no depth in what they were saying. So I saw that as an opportunity, but I didn't realise how difficult that was going to be able to bring that opportunity to life.
Does it say a lot about you, the fact that you're about to lose your house and you went and you spent $60,000 on equipment that you really didn't know what it was all about?
Yeah, I guess what it says, some people would argue I'm stupid, and I'm sure a lot of people did at the time, and I totally understand why. But I believe in myself, and I believe that I'm not stupid, and I believe that I have an eye for opportunity, and that's basically what drove me. Because a lot of people around me, when I brought it up, was sort of like shaking their heads and having blank looks, but to me it made total sense. So I decided to go for it.
And what happened after that?
Yeah, that year, I bought that camera in early 2013, and I did my first Cat 1 course. So I knew what I was talking about, but it was also about being certified, about knowing what I was talking about. And then I went out into the world of mining. I had a lot of contacts who would let me onto their site, and I'd budgeted for 6 months. That's pretty much all we had to get this off the ground. So out I went to all these mine sites, and I've said this to a lot of people is that it was the best year of my life and the worst year of my life. It was the worst year of my life because I only got paid once for that whole year. I think the job was only about between $5,000 and $10,000, so certainly not enough to sustain everything. And we were going broke, so that was the bad part of it. But the good part of it was that nobody was paying me to do this, so nobody really cared whether I got good results or not. And what I did was it gave me the opportunity to do everything very slowly and really take my time to understand what was happening, why it was happening, how quick it was happening, what temperature it started to happen at, what temperature it failed at, what all of those curves look like, which it appears that no one's actually done anywhere. So in hindsight, looking back, that was the best year of my life because I developed a system that related to most pieces of mining equipment, and it became very solid.
So once you started to put that into practice, what was the reaction from the mining industry?
Yeah, so I guess at the end of 2013, when I really wasn't having a lot of success securing anything, I had a lot of people on site who I was doing the freebies for, who were really receptive but weren't willing to pay me for it.
Why not?
Well, I was being told that they had no money to spend. They weren't allowed to spend any money. And so, it was a difficult pill to swallow. And I remember, specifically in 2014, sitting in my office with this $55,000 to $60,000 worth of equipment, and saying, I can't believe how wrong I've got it. I can't believe that they can't see how much I can save them. And with the help of a friend, I actually put together an email that detailed some of those savings to some of those major clients. And I ended up with 2 contracts out of it. So what I learned out of that was people, when their business that they're running is struggling, they don't have the time to work out those things like what you've saved them. So you've got to do that work for them and say, this is what the potential savings are. Imagine if we did this on a regular basis, and that's what led to those 2 contracts. And of course, the people who are signing the purchase orders have to be open-minded. They have to be what's called early adopters in industry. They have to be those type of people who go, I can see what he's saying, and we're going to try that. And it actually takes a lot of courage to do that when you're in the middle of a downturn. So I'm forever grateful to those people.
How much study did you need to do to get yourself to a stage where you could actually give the data to people in a way that would be saving them money?
Well, I guess from March 2013, I finished my course at the end of March 2013 until February 2014. So that's almost full 12 months. And I didn't rest much in that period. So what I did was I studied all of the ISO standards, and I took whatever other standards were out there, and I started with that. And then I worked my way backwards. So there was a significant amount of work in doing that because I didn't know what I was doing. And I had some great mentors along the way, and I'm forever grateful to them, like Eric Thorpe and Wayne Ruddock, because they were the type of people who had the experience, not necessarily in my trade, but they had a lot of thermography experience, and I could either call them or email them and send them an image and say, this is the problem I have. I'm not sure exactly what it is, but I think it's this, and they would guide me along.
Are you a groundbreaker by applying it to the mining industry?
The technology itself has been involved in the mining industry for a long time. I am a groundbreaker in the point that I believe I'm a groundbreaker in the point that the system that I've built. So it's not just the technology. There's actually 3 parts to being successful in that area. One is good technology, and most people are too cheap to buy good technology. 2 is to do the training, right? But the third part is to develop a system. So you can buy good technology and you can get good training, but if you don't have a system that's repeatable, then you won't get repeatable results.
In what way?
If I was to look at you as a human being in an infrared camera, and we perceived part of your musculature as hot, what would be the question you'd ask me? You'd ask me, well, how hot is it? And how bad is that?
No, I'd just say, how hot am I? Sorry.
Right? So you'd want to know. You'd want to know, is that bad or good? And how would we determine whether that's bad or good? Well, we'd have to look at a whole heap of other people, wouldn't we? But the big thing is that we'd have to make that process repeatable, and we'd have to make that process so procedural that we know that you are actually hot, or no, compared to everyone else, actually it's not too bad. You know what I mean? So the same thing is with machinery. We need to look at a whole lot of machines in a whole range of environments, and then take all of the data and correlate that and make sure that it's repeatable. Then that's where you need a system.
Because that data can be manipulated.
Absolutely. Everything can be manipulated to how you want it.
How can that happen?
Right from the imaging process, there's controls in the camera that allow you to manipulate the image, and you can make anything look hot and anything look cold. And this is part of the problem with thermography, is because people take that simple control and then try to sell either their service or the camera by manipulating an object within an image to make it look bad or to make it look good. And that's where part of the problem has been.
How do they do that?
So they adjust something called the span, and the span is, we have an upper and lower temperature level, and we basically tell the camera we want to see between these 2 temperatures. okay? The energy that's relevant to these two temperatures. And so if I wanted to make you look hot, I'd bring the top span down to 35 degrees, and that would mean your whole body would look hot. And intuitively, our brain looks at that image and then looks at the little colour bar on the side and says, yeah, that's hot, when in fact you might be completely normal. If I take that top span up and then move the whole lot up and the bottom up, I can make you look totally cold. I can make you look like you're dead in comparison to somebody else. Okay? So that's how they manipulate the image. So in thermography, you need a good image and you need to extrapolate the data from that image, which is what I spent a lot of time doing. And then you need the ability to trend that data and trace that over time, which is what I did for 7 years. So we have 7 years of data. We have 7 years of images. We have 7 years of reports on every machine, and we have all of these actions that help remedy those problems, and that's what's made the difference.
It's something that's starting to grow. You're starting to teach it these days?
Yeah, so I mentioned Wayne Ruddock, who I met in 2014, and Wayne's been teaching infrared since 1980. So he's well known. He's taught NASA, the US Air Force, the US Army, Coast Guard, etc., etc. He teaches in Mexico a lot at manufacturing plants. And I met him in Australia in 2014. He came to Australia once a year to teach classes, and he was always highly regarded in the thermography world. And when I met him was actually after one of my first ever presentations. And if anyone knows Wayne, he's very upfront and direct, kind of like my father. So I'd made this presentation to a national thermography conference, having only really been involved in the game for a year and a half. And he confronted me after the presentation and started firing a lot of technical questions at me. And I was struggling to keep up. And one of the answers I gave him was a little bit too generalised, and he said to me, well, son, if you're not doing that properly, you're just another idiot with a camera. And then
Because there's a lot of people that float around with a camera and think that they're if they might have an iPhone and they say they're a photographer.
Absolutely, that's right. And that's the analogy I use. I know a lot of professional thermographers, and look at yourself, you're in media. And I say to them, okay, so imagine getting a little disposable camera and then saying to your mate, don't worry about paying for that professional photographer at your wedding, I'll take the photos. You'd get laughed out, wouldn't you? But in the thermography world, that's what people actually do. They get the little iPhone with the infrared camera on it, or they buy a $1,000 or $2,000 camera, and they say, I'm a thermographer. A, they don't know how to drive it, and B, the image is that pixelated that you lose that much information. So it's the same thing, right?
Where do you go to from here? You're teaching around Australia and also now starting to take it overseas?
Yeah, so as part of the process with Wayne, in 2016 he said, look, I'm getting too old to travel over here all the time, and you're probably not going to see me too often. And I said to him, so who's going to do your courses over here? And I wasn't thinking about taking him over because I was actually a bit scared of him because he's very knowledgeable, you know, and I don't think I could fill those boots. I still don't. But at the time I asked him, he said, oh, no one's going to do that because I haven't had anyone express any interest. And I went away and I thought about it for a while, and I thought, I'd really like to try that, but I'm just not confident enough, you know, to be able to do it. So, you know, and now through my experiences in the last 20 years, now whenever a period of self-doubt creeps in, that's a key indicator for me to stand up and face it and confront and break it down as to why I don't think I'm good enough to do it. So I went through that process with myself, and it was purely fear of failure. And then I went through the process of the reasons why I could do it, and they certainly outweighed the reasons why I couldn't do it. So I contacted him by email and said, I don't suppose you think I could be good enough to teach your courses? And he didn't miss a beat. Absolutely. I'm going to need to train you a little bit more, but if you're willing to spend the money to come and train with me, I think it's going to be a perfect fit. And so we taught our first course together at the Royal Australian Navy base in Sydney in 2017, and then I flew to Canada later that year and spent 2 weeks with him up in his mountain log cabin, which was converted upstairs into accommodation and down the bottom as a teaching room. You can imagine this immaculate, proper log cabin up in the Canadian mountains overlooking a lake. It was spectacular. But I was also sitting with one of the best people in the world in my my desired discipline, and I got that one-on-one with him for 2 weeks, and it was absolutely outstanding.
Was it the right place at the right time?
Absolutely. You know, nothing's a coincidence, and it's like the old saying, you know, when the student's ready, the teacher will appear, and I've been very conscious about that, and the same thing occurred with Ken Ware, right? You know, if you're awake and open and watching what's around you, you're going to see those opportunities and these things arise. And once again, most of the time it's our own self-doubt that stops us from stepping up and saying, hey, I want to try this. And so that was certainly the case with Wayne. And, you know, we've enjoyed a great business partnership together since then, where I teach his courses and I teach them in Australia and New Zealand. I've been to Papua New Guinea. I've taught online courses now because of COVID, and we've had people from South America dial in. So it's been a tremendous amount of enjoyment for me, and I feel like it's an achievement for me.
When did you decide to turn the infrared camera back on yourself as part of the neurophysics with Ken?
When in 2013, when I was first involved with Ken, it was quite a funny period because I was going broke. He lived in a mining area in Emerald, so it was kind of a good excuse for me to go out there, when really I just wanted to be out there with him and learn. But I was still promoting the thermography business and visiting mine sites on the way past or whatever. And I'll never forget, he had former World Hawaiian Ironman champion Peter Jacobs in for some treatment. And I was filming him in infrared while he was being treated. And the amount of thermal energy that dissipated from his trapeze in an 8-minute period was astounding for me. And I'd already looked at a lot of different people doing a lot of different things. I'd looked at myself training, so I set up the camera on a tripod and started to record myself training just to watch what happened to my body as it heated up during a training process. And this was all in the looking at it through overtraining. So I wanted to understand what actually happens physiologically and thermally during overtraining. And I went on in 2014 and 15 to write a few case studies about that, which was really interesting. But that was all a result of what happened on that day. And I'll never forget that day as long as I live, because the camera doesn't lie. It's a highly tuned scientific instrument, and it's very accurate. And thermal energy just doesn't disappear, and it certainly doesn't distribute itself in a human being. So from that point on, the penny had dropped for both myself and for Ken that this could be an extremely valuable tool.
So how has the medical fraternity taken on this sort of treatment?
The treatment with neurophysics as well as the infrared, or each and both? Yep. So if you look at neurophysics on its own, I guess it's kind of like my story with the thermography and the mining industry. It's been quite slow. And remember, Ken's been at this for now 40 years nearly. So he's one of my inspirations for persistence. He's been in the same boat but for much longer, where he knew his system worked and he was persistent enough to get it. And now he chairs the International Brain Disorder and Neurology Conference yearly, or he's part of the executive, you know. And so as far as non-surgical interventions in neurology, he's recognised in science as being, you know, some of the best in the world.
Because he's had a lot of success.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, he's John McLean is a great story. In 2014, I think that was, where John hadn't walked properly for 25 years unassisted, and then within 3 days of Ken's therapy, he was taking his first steps in 25 years. I've, you know, personally seen so many spinal cord injury patients improving or standing on their own and moving along their way, brain injury patients, you know. So it certainly is an outstanding therapy, and it is taking time to be recognised, but it will, just like all good things.
Is it something that you retain your passion for and want to be doing for the next, say, 20 years?
Absolutely, yeah. I'm nearly at the end of my studies, and I've been very slow. And I'm forever grateful for Ken and his wife, Nikki, and the tutors at neuro-physics. Because I guess at my core, I love helping people, and I can't think of a better way to do it. And the beautiful thing, as it turned out, is that I get to combine two passions, which is helping people and thermography. So what I'm looking forward to in the future is having my own rehabilitation centre, but bringing this infrared technology in and partnering up with some scientists like I have in the last 5 years. So there's been a lot of small wins in the science world with what we do, and I'm really looking forward to bringing that to fruition, because I've been the hold-up because of the amount of time and energy I have.
You've been a fairly successful amateur boxer. You've delved into the thermography, both in the mining industry and also the neurophysics. What would you consider your greatest achievement?
Yeah, being a dad.
Why is that? How's that?
You know, those little people are, they're just the most amazing thing that's ever happened to me. You know, I've got my favourite coffee cup, and it's just world's greatest dad. That's the proudest. That's the best trophy I've ever been given, and I don't think anyone could give me a better trophy. You know, so that's how strongly I feel about my achievement of being a dad. Yeah, so it's fantastic.
What's the biggest thing that your kids have taught you?
Through all the, you know, obviously my kids were there through all of those tough times, and that type of unconditional love that you get to come home to every day is what makes everything okay, you know. And I when I stepped out of my own road there after 2013 and 14, as I went through my process, I looked at them and realised how much joy they saw in life in the little things, you know. The way they embrace life and the way they look at new things is amazing. And I feel that we lose that as we get older, and everything becomes kind of, oh yeah, you know, I've seen it all before. Well, you haven't really. You just haven't seen, you've seen something like it, but not something the same. And, you know, my son, I tell this story a lot when I watch him go to school in the mornings, and if I get to drop him off, he goes to school with the same group of kids every day. But every day he runs over to them and hugs them like he hasn't seen him in 2 weeks, not that he saw him yesterday at school. And to me, that is what you learn from a child, how to be that joyous and how to love your friends and your family around you, you know. So I try and embrace that and try and enjoy that life. And, you know, like we do when we meet each other, we give each other a big hug. And I do that with a lot of my good friends, because I think that it's just the most amazing thing you can do is say good day to your mate and give them a good hug, you know. And that's what I've learned from my children. They're the most amazing teachers ever.
And a great way to wrap things up. Jeff Erichsen, thanks for joining us over the bonnet.
Thanks for having me, Mark.